Hi, Helen. It's great to have you here at the event. So right now, as we've just been hearing, a consumer has got a phone in their hand, a laptop on their desk, a tablet at home. What is the ideal sort of consumer experience within retail at the moment?
I think it's a great question, Matt. And one, I think that at EY we think is a very curious one. A year ago, and I've shared this with Matt, but for everyone else, a year ago, we set out on a programme of activity to understand what we call the future consumer. Much debate about what we should call that research. No one agreed, of course, and no one agreed on the horizon. So we landed on future consumer now in a 2030 frame. And we ran a series of hacks in 5 cities, so across sort of most of our continents, Shanghai, Mumbai, of course San Francisco, and the UK and Berlin. And we asked a group of futurists and retailers and experts what they thought the future would bring, and how consumers were going to be not just shopping, but eating, living, consuming, how they were going to be playing, how they were going to be staying healthy. So a really wide frame, really to reflect the way we're seeing consumers are sort of spending their wallet.
And presumably there's a really clear answer that what this one person of the future is.
Really nice setup. Kind of yes and no. And I think from the research there were some things we thought were really not that exciting, which I'll sort of pepper through the conversation we're having now. But there was one standout piece that we thought was very interesting. So we, historically have had this split of online and offline. And what we think in the future, there will be a split between the way we as consumers buy and the way we shop. And we think that buying will be about artificial intelligence enabling an automated experience, and that shopping will be the way that we as consumers actively seek experiences and to buy products and services that sort of identify what we identify with or define who we are. So there'll be this split, and we think the new, if you like, the new sort of decision tree will not be online or offline shopping. It will be, do I buy, and is that a more automated experience or convenient experience, or do I shop and look for something that's much more experiential?
Mm-hmm. And is the result of this going to be that consumers have a lot more power over retailers in terms of where they're spending their money and if they're tied into brands and certain individual retailers?
It's a great question. Yes, I think it will. I think we've seen the last 10 years, particularly, consumers have become incredibly powerful. There's an incredible transparency in terms of, a consumer's ability to see whether they can buy a certain product or proposition sort of cheaper or better from another location. Even when they're in a shop, they're often looking online to see what the alternative might be. So yes, I think it gives yet more power to consumers in terms of their options.
Mm-hmm. And with brick and mortar stores, obviously we've heard a lot today and for the last few years about the changes that are going on the high street, and really that is an area that's been hit quite a lot. Going forward, as you say there may be more space for experiential shopping environments, what do you see them looking like?
So it's interesting. I think there's been much talked about sort of in terms of, at one point, I think 5 years ago, we had, will there be a future, will there be stores in the future? And I think the sort of the thinking we've done just reinforces yet again that yes, there absolutely is a place for experience in a physical location if that's part of your proposition, critically. But it's going to be ever more important to make sure that that environment's in the right place, but also that it's offering something that's really special or different, and is sort of targeted at the consumers that you're really trying to engage with.
Mm-hmm. And with we just had an example of using voice to order a coffee from Starbucks. Yeah. In terms of like the overall retail experience and how automated it's going to become, I could see a future where I'm quite happy to let my washing tablets be automatically replaced when I run out. Obviously that's a bit different for coffee, but how much of is there with a sort of automation play within this area?
Yeah, it's a good question again. I think the technology that we have today is going to, and we all see it, and the pace of change appears to, and we think will continue to increase. One of the sort of things we looked at in our research was in creating a set of future worlds as to what the future might look like. We had one world that had an AI called Alfred in it, and Alfred was the butler of the future. And Alfred, I mean, it's only a story, but it's one of the pieces that we came up with, and we reflected on, well, what would it be like or what will it be like when, if you want a personal AI, you can have a personal AI, and you have this digital assistant. And someone actually tried to organise a meeting with me last week with a digital assistant, and unfortunately, the digital assistant couldn't find a time that worked for everyone. But I think we see the beginnings of this. But in the future, if we can get to personal assistants which really know us and know our desires and our intents, that can start to be, I think, the beginning of unlocking the sort of clunkiness of some of the platforms that are out there in automating as much of our lives as we want to.
Yeah, and we've seen with those sort of examples at the moment, I think there's been some sort of third-party research that says people that have used Amazon products for buying stuff have done so on a very limited basis, and people haven't necessarily gone back and made repeat purchases when they've done that. Are the technologies, they're obviously here, but are they that useful for people at the moment?
I think the stats, I think the other stat I saw, which is complementary to that, is that a very, very high percentage of families now have, certainly in the UK, now have some kind of assistant, home assistant, in homes. So, and we were talking earlier in a breakfast that we hosted about what people use their digital assistants for at home, and it seemed to be mostly playing radio too, rather than actually buying at this point. But I think the platforms are starting to be available. Technology is a bit clunky, and I think if we get to a point with the advent of 5G and other new technologies, we will start to see that these pieces, smart devices, etc., will start to link up and actually start to provide, I would say, meaningful solutions for consumers, but also for retailers.
Yeah, do you think there's one section of retailers that are sort of being squeezed more than others at the moment? Like, obviously, you've got companies that are very much on top of their sort of technological offerings and what they provide to consumers in creating like as much of a frictionless environment as possible. You've got the other extreme, which is your local butchers. What about this sort of middle that may be like dabbling in technology but also not really getting their proposition sorted yet?
I think it's always been difficult to be in the middle in retail. It's always been, I would say this, I've worked in retail an awfully long time, but I think it's always been difficult being in the middle and not having a proposition that's really different. I think there are always companies which find themselves with sort of maybe losing their way a little in terms of really understanding the consumer they're trying to serve, and not aligning their proposition with that. And I think, being in the middle is usually a situation that doesn't last for long. Because it ends up in a decline, and I think we've seen that particularly this year and last year as competition's become more fierce. So there is incredible distress, and we've talked about that a little bit this morning in our sector. So I think being in the middle has always been a bad thing. I think over the last 5 years it's become a very bad place to be, and so there's this a sort of a drumbeat or an imperative to just be laser focused on being special, being different, and really knowing your own consumer.
What do you think being different means in retail at the moment? And how does that change going forward as well? Yeah,
it's a great question. So I think there's, being different can mean different things. So I think there's a piece for me which is you can be different as a retailer by creating a different environment. You can be different in retail by having own brands, and a number of companies that we know and love are starting to do that. You can be different sort of through environment, through product, or through the services that you offer. So extending services to sort of appeal to the consumers you're trying to get to. So I think it can be many things, and I think it can also start to play not just to selling products, but actually a wider range of services. And we've seen a number of the big players start to explore financial services and other even entertainment sort of and leisure sort of relationships in order to exploit that. So I think there's lots that can be done. I think it does come back to who's the consumer you're trying to serve, and how do you engage with them and kind of keep them loyal.
And if we're looking at a future where there's going to be potentially more experiential experiences, either in-store or online, what sort of shape do you think these will take place in, and what will attract consumers?
Experiential, sort of experiences in physical locations. I think there are some great examples out there even today of retailers and other organisations starting to offer services. There are some really interesting ones within the hotel industry of unique sort of preferred loyalty schemes where you get access to a particular artist. In retail, there are many, many examples of fitness classes and cookery demonstrations. So I think many of these examples don't necessarily rely on high tech. But I think there are also similarly sort of pure plays and online players who have managed to create great experiences online, whether that be through delivering sort of frictionless or great information about products, or allowing, there are a couple of retailers now that are starting to offer you to be able to try onto a sort of virtual mannequin the clothes and sort of have a look and see how that feels. And none of these things are right for everybody, but I think there are so many things that can be done. It's just a case of, it's almost picking your poison and figuring out for your consumer which path do you want to take, and also where do you want to invest, because all of this takes time, effort, distraction. And one of the great questions one of our colleagues this morning in the breakfast asked was around profitability. Because I think this, in many respects, the holy grail of retail today is how do you kind of release, get rid of costs that are unnecessary and kind of redivert that into the new and into sort of being able to grow and be profitable.
And where do you think that sort of balance lies?
I think, where do I think the balance lies? I think increasingly being ruthless. I think it is different. The businesses which are growing incredibly quickly and maybe are younger have a slightly different dimension. But for the more traditional players, what I'm seeing is a sort of ruthless determination to really start to take costs out, which has surprised us. I think there's a number of household names who've announced, quite big changes to headcount. So they're kind of looking for ways to really take cost out where they don't have to or where they don't think it's going to make a difference. In order to invest in the new. And there's a thread this morning which I really liked around innovation and how to innovate and how to make sure you're kind of fueling the new and failing fast, but making sure that doesn't cost too much and feeding that back in. So there's a few themes there. I think ruthless with costs, but also really making space and energy for innovation.
And what sort of role does personalisation play in this, in terms of that idea of a consumer a few years down the line that's probably can easily make a payment online, can move to a different retailer very easily? How much do brands have to be like drawing in customers and trying to withhold them for long periods?
I think some of the biggest names that we know I would say in the East, I'd look to China for some of the really standout examples of sort of platforms that are dominating. I think we talk a lot about Amazon, and it's an incredible business. But there are other platforms. I've got a number of them here over the event at Wired Smarter. So I think the future is going to be quite interesting. I think there's inspiration from the platforms. And consumers are going to be sort of attracted to that. And I think many of our traditional retailers will be looking for ways to sort of, I would say, compete. And it always draws me back to the future consumer and how do you kind of keep that at the heart of what you're offering.
And what sense do you get of what people don't want in the future in terms of their retail experiences?
That's a really good question. I think, so one of the themes we haven't talked about is technology. So we talk a lot about technology, and I think it's risky to talk about technology for technology's sake. So I think 5 years from now, technology will become more transparent, will become part of everything we do, and I would say the adoption of data and the further adoption of AI to give great experiences is going to mean that consumers will be able to have a much richer experience, but almost not notice it. So I would, again, I would go to, what do consumers want in the future? I think they're going to want more. They're going to continue to want it now, and they're going to, want great products and services. So I think providing that to consumers and sort of staying absolutely centred on what they're looking for and doing that in an increasingly frictionless way is going to be key to winning.
And I guess sort of the final question from myself on this. As we're all sitting in a room here, obviously lots of people who are in decision-making positions and can introduce change, not instantly, but over the next few months. What should people be looking at to alter next?
So it's a big question. So I think altering a business and sort of taking any business forward is what we continue to have to do in order to kind of adopt those sort of, it's almost the next innovations that are coming. So I think, what next? I think it's making sure that you are as lean as you can be, taking costs out where it's really not needed. But I honestly think most of my colleagues here are already doing that. And I think critically for me, it's making space for innovation, making space for innovation and the new, but doing that in a kind of connected way and not forgetting, I have said this before, the consumer.
Cool. Thank you very much. Helen Merriott, partner in retail and consumer products at UK and Ireland EY. Thank you very much.